All right, 8th graders, here it is. You asked for it. I had students asking me from the MAPS test about imaginary numbers. This is an Algebra 2 concept, but I would be glad to go over it with you in this short video. So let's just start what an imaginary number is. What does it look like? What does it do? Etc. Now, as always, I always like to give some background information on what we're leading into and why we're looking at it. Now, up until this year, or actually ever since you've start talking about numbers, you've talked about real numbers. Real numbers can be broken down into rational numbers, which include integers, whole numbers, and natural numbers, or irrational numbers, such as pi. What you've never talked about are the overreigning complex numbers, which covers everything. So complex numbers and imaginary numbers are the hierarchy, or what's higher up than real numbers. Now, an imaginary unit is I, so we'll explain that in a second. But there are imaginary numbers. So what is the imaginary unit? Let me just break it down to you. The imaginary number is I. Anytime you have a number that does not exist, it is I. Now, some people are like, well, wait a minute, what is that number? Well, we don't know because it's imaginary. So an imaginary number does not exist. So for example, if you would solve the equation x squared equals negative 3, you'd have to take the square root of both sides. Well, you would get x equals the square root of negative 3, which you can't do. You can't take the square root of negative 3. There is nothing times itself that would give you negative 3. So that leads us into the imaginary unit. To overcome this problem, mathematicians created an expanded system of numbers using the imaginary unit. Here's what it means. The square root of negative 1 would actually be represented as I. The only really rule that you have to know is this. I squared equals negative 1. If you multiply two imaginary numbers together, you will always get negative 1. So you're probably thinking, what in the world are we talking about? How does this even make sense? Here's what I'm going to show you. What is the square root of 25? It's 5. What's the square root of negative 25? Now, if you did it on your calculator or whatever before, you can't do it. It's not possible. Here's what you do. The square root of 25 is still 5. But because there's a negative inside, you're just going to put 5i. That's it. So if there's a negative on the inside of a square root, you're just going to take it and put an I in front, or I after the 5. So for example, if I said the square root of negative 81, and that's it. What is that? That would be 9i. Now, over here, negative 3, it would be the square root of 3, since I cannot actually do anything with that, and the I would come out front. So if there's a negative 1 inside, the I comes out front. So I'm going to show you how this works again. The square root of 36 would give us 6. If I squared this and went back to where I started with, 6 squared is 36. So if I took the square root of negative 36, that would be 6i. Now if I squared 6i, here's what it looks like. 6i squared is really 6i times 6i. 6 times 6 is 36. I times I is that one thing you must memorize. I squared is negative 1. That's your rule. So I times I gives us negative 1. So your answer would be negative 36, which is what we started with. If I'm doing these examples, the square root of negative 25 would be negative 5i. The square root of negative 72. Now wait a minute, 72 is not a perfect square. So we're going to pretend this negative is just going to come right on outside. You get I. And then you're left with the square root of 72. So then, the square root of 72 breaks down into the square root of 36 times the square root of 2, since 36 is a perfect square. So then the square root of 36 is 6, so you would get 6i times the square root of 2. Over here, this would be negative 5 times I, and since the square root of 9 is 3, you'd have that. So negative 5 times negative 5 times positive 3 is negative 15i. So the answer would be negative 15i. Now, you'll learn more about this when you get to high school, but I'm going to give you a very basic understanding. Real numbers are numbers like this. These are all real numbers. The moment you have an I, it's imaginary. And a pure imaginary number is just when you have one term, like negative 4i, 5i, 7i, 6i. The moment you have a binomial with another number, 2 is a real number. So if you combine a real number with an imaginary number, then it's just a regular imaginary number. Without the real number, like a 2 or a 5 in front, it's a pure imaginary number. So I'm going to show you how you add, subtract, or multiply imaginary numbers. Here's the great news. It's super easy. A is 8 minus I plus 5 plus 4i. All you do is combine like terms. The plus is here. I don't have to distribute anything. So I do 8 plus 5. That's 13. Negative 1i plus 4i gives me plus 3i. These are not like terms. Therefore, your answer is 13 plus 3i. And that's what it would be in standard form. B. You have 7 minus 6i minus the quantity 3 minus 6i. You first distribute the negative. 7 minus 6i minus 3 plus 6i. Combine like terms. Minus 6i plus 6i, they cancel. So 7 minus 3 is 4. You're done. And lastly, C. 13, if I distribute, that would be negative 2 minus 7i plus 5i. 13 minus 2 gives me 11. Negative 7i plus 5i gives me negative 2i. Now we're going to multiply. You follow the exact same rules. The only thing that's going to be different is don't ever forget this. I squared equals negative 1. So we're going to start in A. We're going to distribute. 4i times negative 6 gives me negative 4i. Then I have 4i times I gives me 4i squared. We have to go one more step. Negative 24i plus, well, remember, this right here gives me negative 1. So 4 times negative 1 gives me negative 4. Now, if we put it in standard form, the real number is going to go first. So the negative 4 is going to go first, minus 24i. There's my answer. Over here, we're going to, you've been taught FOIL, but we're going to multiply the binomial times the binomial. So we take 9 times negative 4, negative 36. 9 times 7i plus 63i. Negative 2i times negative 4 plus 8i. And negative 2i times 7i is negative 14i squared. Negative 36, I combined 63i plus 8i. That's 71i. Now, I squared, this is it. I squared is what? Negative 1. So I take negative 14 times negative 1, which gives me plus 14. I combine like terms. Negative 36 plus 14 gives you negative 22 plus 71i. And there's your answer. If you want to go one step further, let's solve an equation. This is actually pretty easy. A, x squared plus 4 equals 0. Step 1. We get the x squared by itself, so I subtract 4. I now take the square root of both sides. X equals, now remember, if you take the square root, you get plus or minus. The square root of 4 is 2, and because we have a negative, it's 2i. So your answer is plus or minus plus or minus 2i. B, you're going to get 2x squared. Move the plus 11 over. That gives us negative 36. I then divide both sides by 2. That gives me x squared equals negative 18. I then take the square root of both sides. That's going to give me x equals plus or minus. Now remember, 18. If you simplify the radical, you break it up into 9 and 2. The square root of 9 is 3, so it would be 3. Since it's a negative, it's I. The square root of 2 stays inside. So your answer would be plus or minus 3i times the square root of 2.